This episode is brought to you by Hasa. Liquid is clearly better. Liquid chlorine is the highest purity, works immediately, has no added cyanuric acid or calcium, and it will leave your pool safe, clean, and clear. And by the bottom feeder professional grade battery powered vacuum system. It sucks to clean pools, so cleaning pools sucks less. Get $100 off with code DVB100.
This episode is brought to you by Skimmer, the #1 pool service software in North America. With Skimmer, you can streamline your schedule, grow your revenue, and keep your customers coming back with 5-star service. Whether you're a one-person operation or an established team, Skimmer is your partner in success. Visit getskimmer.com/poolguy to try Skimmer for free for 30 days.
The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show.
Hi, welcome to the Pool Guy Podcast Show. I recently did a podcast on why a saltwater pool would have zero chlorine or is not holding chlorine. So I thought I would cover why a regular chlorine pool, quote unquote, where you're using trichlor tablets, liquid chlorine or cal hypo or dichlor, would not have the ability to hold chlorine maybe day to day or week to week. Are you a pool service pro looking to take your business to the next level? Join the Pool Guy coaching program. Get expert advice, business tips, exclusive content, and get direct support from me. I'm a 35-year veteran in the industry. Whether you're starting out or scaling up, I've got the tools to help you succeed. Learn more at swimmingpoollearning.com. Since there are so many factors that will play into this equation of why the pool's not holding chlorine, I'll start with some basic ones that you can eliminate, and this may solve the problem. One of the most basic is that you have poor filtration going on in the pool. And this is something that you don't think about too much, but if you're out in the field and you've ever experienced this, where you had a D filter that had torn grids and D was leaking back into the pool, you may notice that the water quality starts to deteriorate rapidly, and also the chlorine level may zero out pretty rapidly in a pool. In this case, where the filtration system is not working. Maybe you have a cartridge filter where it's a single cartridge filter and you haven't changed it for 2 years, or the customer hasn't changed it for 2 years. There's very little water flow, and you'll notice that the chlorine isn't holding in that pool as well. The moment you fix the DE grids, replacing all 8 grids in some cases, and recharging them with fresh DE, you'll notice almost immediately, that the chlorine level holds in that pool tremendously better than when the filter wasn't working. When you replace that single cartridge filter with a brand new cartridge, you're going to notice immediately that the chlorine level is holding in the pool. So the filtration of the pool is one of the primary factors. If you have poor filtration, you're not going to have the chlorine being distributed or circulated or being effective in the pool, which means other things in the pool are going to, of course, destroy the chlorine level, and that's why the filtration is really important. And then second to that, in conjunction with the filtration, is the pool's runtime. If you have a brand new filter with brand new DE in the grids and you run the pool 1 hour a day, I can almost guarantee you that that pool is not going to have a consistent nor significant chlorine level. If you run that pool, of course, 8 to 10 or 12 hours a day, or the VS pump, if you're running it 18 hours a day, you're going to have a better chance of having a good chlorine level in that pool day in and day out, week in and week out, than if you're running that pool 2 hours a day or 3 hours a day. So circulation and filtration are sometimes the primary reason that the chlorine level is zeroing out or not holding properly day to day. Another big one is the water quality. If the water quality is impacted in any way, it's going to affect the chlorine level in the pool as well. What I mean by impacted is if you look at the pool and you can't see the third step because the water is so cloudy, you can't see past the third step, and you certainly can't see the pool bottom because the water is cloudy. There's a lot of stuff in that water that's going to destroy the chlorine level in that pool. And so besides filtration and circulation, the overall initial water quality of the pool is a big factor in the chlorine holding in the pool. I'm sure you've done this before. If you've done green pool cleanups, you've had a green pool, let's just say it's a 15,000 gallon green pool, and it's at a level where there's like mosquito larvae and tadpoles forming in the pool, and you shock that pool. You put in, let's just say, 20 gallons of liquid chlorine and 10 bags of cal hypo, and you bring the chlorine level up to, 200 parts per million, something like crazy like that. Clean the filter, run the pool for 24 hours. You get back there the next day and check the chlorine level, and you're like at 5 parts per million, or you're at 2 parts per million, or you're at 0. And you put all that chlorine in there. But of course, the pool should look a lot better. It should be like a milky blue, where you can probably see the top step. All the green algae has been killed. There's a lot of dead algae dust on the bottom. All the mosquito larvae and tadpoles have miraculously disappeared. They don't exist anymore. They've been, kind of consumed and evaporated by the chlorine or fall into the bottom of the pool. And you have no chlorine in the pool, and you put a ton of chlorine in there. But there was so much stuff in the water that it, quote unquote, used up all the chlorine during that process. And so if you haven't experienced that, you probably will when you do green pool cleanups, is that you put in so much chlorine that you think you're going to go back there the next day and it'll be like at 20 parts per million when it's actually at 0. And that's what I mean by initial water quality. If the water is cloudy, that means that there are things in the water, combined chlorine is one of them, that makes the chlorine ineffective, and it's going to cause the chlorine to zero out in a lot of cases. So just be aware that along with filtration, circulation, water quality is also a big factor in how long the chlorine lasts in the pool. The more cloudy the pool is, the more murky it is, the more green it is or yellow it is with algae, the less likely the chlorine level will be consistent and be able to be sustainable in that pool. So of course, you can shock the pool to a shock level of 20 to 30 parts per million, clean the filter, run the pool, get it back to blue again, and then the chlorine should hold pretty well in that pool, given the fact that the water quality has improved dramatically with the process of shocking it, filtering it, cleaning all the gunk out of the bottom of the pool, and getting it back to a pristine, clear blue pool. Another factor that kind of goes with the water quality is how much cyanuric acid is in that particular body of water, that pool account, service account, how much cyanuric acid is in that pool, because it actually can go both directions. Now there's a sweet spot, and my sweet spot for most pools is 50 to 100 parts per million of cyanuric acid. That's kind of the area where the chlorine is going to be most effective. After 100 parts per million, things start to go a little sideways for you, especially if you're using Bob Lowry's 7.5% formula, which I'll touch on in a second. And you can also have too little cyanuric acid. Anything below 20 parts per million, or even 10 parts per million, or even 0 cyanuric acid will cause problems with the chlorine holding in the pool. The reason why cyanuric acid was invented was that back in the day, you would have to actually go to the pool every day to put chlorine in there because there was no way to protect it in the summer from the sun's UV rays burning off the chlorine in the pool. The cyanuric acid is kind of like sunscreen. It will slow down the UV rays that will destroy the chlorine in the water to a point where the chlorine is going to stay in there that normally would only stay in there for 3 hours with no cyanuric acid at all, where you can have it actually stay in the pool for 20 hours. And so that's why the cyanuric acid was created, and that's to extend the life of the chlorine in the pool. Before that, again, you would have to add chlorine every day to the pool, and now you can not need to do that because the cyanuric acid will actually stretch out the chlorine. Now, if you're in an area like Texas where the UV index is at the highest point in the summer, you have to factor that in as well, because even with cyanuric acid in the pool water, with the UV index at the maximum, it's going to burn off the chlorine even faster than if it was at a minimum UV with the cyanuric acid level, let's say 80 parts per million. So the higher the UV level, the more the chlorine will even burn off, even if it's being protected by the cyanuric acid, because it's not a end-all fail-safe, and there's going to be some burn-off depending on how high that UV index is, regardless of the cyanuric acid level in the pool. Of course, if you have a cyanuric acid level of 20 parts per million in the pool, it's going to be pretty much useless because it's too low to protect chlorine over a certain part per million. The old school formula is that At 30 parts per million, it'll protect chlorine to 3 parts per million. At 20 parts per million, it'll protect chlorine to 2 parts per million. And at 50 parts per million, it'll protect chlorine up to 5 parts per million. I think that's a fair formula, even though it's not totally scientific. It still gives you an idea of the cyanuric acid level and how many parts per million of chlorine is being protected each day from the sun's UV rays. Chlorine is going to have a normal, of course, degeneration in the pool water, and Bob Lowry says that normally you'll lose 1 part per million per day. So if you're at the beginning of the week and you're at 8 parts per million, by the time you get to that same pool a week later, you're going to be at 1 part per million, unless you're adding chlorine to that pool to maintain that level at 8 parts per million daily. And the Pool Guy Podcast Show has teamed up with UPA to bring you affordable, reliable liability insurance starting at just $64 a month. Get up to $2 million in coverage, and the members of my coaching group get an even lower rate. Protect your business and your peace of mind. Sign up with UPA today by clicking the link in the podcast description. Now let me address too much cyanuric acid in the pool water and the effect that has on the chlorine. So there's a formula that Bob Lowry came up with, and that's your free chlorine should be 7.5% of your cyanuric acid level in the pool. So if your cyanuric acid level is at 100 parts per million, you're going to need to maintain a free chlorine level, a minimum free chlorine level of 7.5 parts per million for that chlorine to be effective in the pool. If your cyanuric acid level is 200 parts per million in that pool, you're going to need to maintain 14 parts per million of free chlorine in that pool for the chlorine to be effective. And that's why in a lot of cases, your pool will zero out in chlorine. You may get to that pool and you may be at 5 parts per million of chlorine, and then you add some chlorine to bring it up a little bit, and you get back to the next week, you're at 1 part or you're at 0, but that pool has 200 parts per million of cyanuric acid in it. At 5 parts per million, you're way below the 14 parts per million necessary to maintain that pool and make the chlorine effective. And so you can kind of see how it's a head scratcher sometimes when you're at a pool and the chlorine looks fine. You're at maybe 8 parts per million and you think that you're fine, so you don't add any chlorine to the pool. You get back to the next week and you're at 0 because that pool actually has a cyanuric acid level of 200 parts per million and you needed 14 parts per million for that chlorine to be effective, if that makes sense. Regardless, if you follow Bob Lowry's formula, just know that the higher the cyanuric acid level in the pool, the higher the free chlorine level needs to be in the pool for the chlorine to be effective to prevent algae growing in that pool. And as you know from being in the industry, algae is a huge consumer of the chlorine in the pool. There's actually a potential for algae being in the pool that you can't see immediately. And it's one of those things where you can maybe feel it if you put your hand in there and rub it on the surface. You can feel a little bit slimy, but you can't actually see the yellow algae forming or green algae forming because it's in the early stages of developing. But even in the early stages, it's consuming a huge amount of chlorine and it's causing the chlorine level to drop rapidly in the pool. In fact, if you have ever done this, and I've been guilty of this, you get to a pool, there's maybe some yellow algae on the steps and deep end, and you just simply brush it off, and maybe you'll bring the chlorine, you just put 1 or 2 tablets in the floater, because the chlorine level is already at 3 parts per million, you're not really thinking any big deal, just a little bit of algae, you'll just brush it off. But have you ever gotten back to a pool like that the next week, and the entire deep end is covered in algae, all the walls are covered, and the chlorine, of course, is at 0, because the algae, that little bit that you saw and brushed off, was not really all the algae that was in the pool. All the algae was actually forming, and you couldn't see it. And by you not shocking the pool, caused the algae to bloom to a point where everything was consumed, all the chlorine was consumed, and the algae just took off. So that does happen, and that is a reality out there. So maintaining the proper cyanuric acid level is key. Too low, you're going to have the chlorine burning off too fast. Too high, you're going to have the chlorine being ineffective in the pool. And I know it's kind of one of those things where the cyanuric acid is a great tool and it's a great asset to the industry, but anything used in excess, if you eat cake every day for a year and you have pancakes for breakfast and you have waffles with chicken for lunch, I can almost guarantee that you're going to have some pretty bad side effects from your eating habits. And everything in moderation is key. How you eat and how much cyanuric acid you utilize in the pool are all factors in the chlorine sustaining itself and being viable and being somewhat sustainable in the pool. So the higher the cyanuric acid level, again, the more chlorine you're going to have in the pool for it to be effective. Now, I didn't mention high bather load, and that's kind of an obvious use of chlorine. If you do commercial pools, you know that you're fighting a losing battle sometimes trying to maintain that chlorine level in the summertime. Same thing in a backyard pool with heavy use. You may be fighting a losing battle in that case. But just know that in reality, the higher the bather load, the more chlorine is going to be used up in the pool. And that's just something that's a given in the industry. Something that I think I should address here is phosphates in the pool water. This is something that particularly has been a growing problem over the years, because a lot of city municipalities use orthophosphate to keep their pipes from rusting. A lot of household products has phosphates in it. People go swimming and it goes off into the pool. Some of it may even just blow into the pool. So phosphates are a source of food for the algae and something that causes the chlorine to be used up rapidly because the algae is feeding on the phosphates and growing in the pool. And something you can do to, of course, eliminate the phosphates in the pool is to put a phosphate remover in the pool, maybe use a weekly dose of it. You can test for phosphates, and if it's anything over 300 parts per billion, you have to treat it and take care of it before it gets worse and becomes a greater problem in the pool. You can also use a Pool-Rx in there, and with the Pool-Rx, it doesn't really matter what the phosphate level is because it's a mineral technology. It'll actually prevent the chlorine from having any problems with the phosphate level. But if you really wanted to cure that pool of the phosphates, you definitely would want to use a phosphate remover to remove the phosphates in the water and thereby removing a food source for the algae and remove one of the reasons why chlorine doesn't hold in the pool, and that's because of the higher phosphate level in the pool itself. And lastly, I'll touch on nitrates. Nitrates are kind of like the kiss of death for the pool water. If you have a pool that has nitrates in it, and again, this could come from sources that blow into the pool. Typically, it happens in more agricultural areas where you have a problem with nitrates. But if you do have a pool where you're putting in a ton of chlorine, and I've had this happen to me, the pool was perfectly fine, never had a problem with it. And then just 1 week, it just started to have problems holding chlorine. And so it's one of those things where I was putting in 4 gallons of liquid chlorine, and I was putting in extra tablets to kind of hold the chlorine. It wasn't helping because the cyanuric acid level was going up at that point, and I was just putting a ton of chlorine, and I couldn't figure out why the pool kept zeroing out. Filter was clean, everything was fine, and then I did a nitrate test, and of course it came back that it had nitrates in it, and basically the nitrates were destroying the chlorine level in the pool, and there's really no real cure for it except draining the pool and refilling it to get rid of the nitrates in the water. Not super common, but if you have a pool where you're trying everything you can to keep it and it's still dropping, nitrates may be the cause of that. So get some nitrate test strips and test your pool for that if that is what you're facing. And one thing that probably could be obvious and it could not be obvious is if the pool has a water leak. That would cause the chlorine, of course, to be diluted with the leak. And typically, if a pool is leaking water, you're going to see the calcium hardness levels as well as the cyanuric acid levels. If it's a salt pool, you're going to see the salinity level dropping in the pool. You're going to see the pH rising rapidly in that pool as fresh water is being added all the time, especially if it has an autofill. So a leak is going to have some definite signs besides not holding chlorine. You're going to notice that the other numbers are also changing, as well as the chlorine being zeroed out every week with the water loss in the pool. So be aware of the water loss is a big factor as well. But I think I covered most of the factors here of why when you test the pool water you're going to have zero chlorine. And there are a few more that I didn't cover here, but most of these are going to be the cases you're going to run into. And once you solve these problems, the chlorine level should hold pretty well in the pools that you're servicing. If you're looking for other podcasts, you can find those on my website, singaporelearning.com. On the banner, click on the podcast icon. There'll be a drop-down menu of over 1,800 podcasts for you there. And if you're interested in the coaching program that I offer, you can learn more at poolguycoaching.com. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Have a great rest of your week, and God bless. This episode is brought to you by HASA, providing products that deliver clean, healthy water for every aspect of everyday life. The bottom feeder battery-powered vacuum system, portable, powerful, and only weighs 12 pounds. And Skimmer. Get Skimmer, America's #1 pool service software. Podcast listeners can try Skimmer for free at getskimmer.com/poolguy.